The War of the Roses. Wars of the Roses have occurred throughout human history in many lands and nations, varying greatly in nature and ferocity. There have been bloody wars lasting decades, but there have also been so-called soft Wars of the Roses, lasting a day or two, limited mainly to bickering, clobbering each other with sticks, chasing one another, twisting arms, and trading blows to the jaw. The most recent known soft War of the Roses took place in a small border state of the European Union. In historical terms, it happened quite recently, in the first quarter of the 21st century. But so that the good reader might understand the nature of a War of the Roses, I shall refresh their memory by returning to events that took place centuries ago. In 1455, a war broke out in England between the houses of Lancaster and York over the English throne. This war came to be called the War of the Roses because the emblem of the House of Lancaster was adorned with a red rose, while the emblem of the House of York bore a white rose. From 1413 to 1422, King Henry V ruled England. When he died, the throne was inherited by his infant son, Henry VI. Regents began to lead the country. The representatives of the House of Lancaster tried to exploit this, believing they too had a right to the throne as descendants of John, the fourth son of Edward III, King of England 1327 to 1377. At the same time, Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, also wished to ascend the throne. He was a descendant of Lionel of Antwerp, the second son of Edward III. The Duke was a capable military leader, having fought successfully in France and Ireland in the interest of the English crown. Henry VI came of age and took over the reins of government, ruling from 1422 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. However, he was mentally unstable, and consequently, his rule was unstable, one might even say idiotic. The rivalry between the Red and White Rose dynasties and the attempts to seize power continued. Duke Richard Plantagenet was constantly in court against the representatives of the rival Red Rose Lancaster family. Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, also intervened in these proceedings, fearing the Duke might deprive her and Henry's son, Edward, of the throne. Constant bickering and clashes occurred between the Red and White Rose dynasties, including armed combat. The first major battle of the War of the Roses, the Battle of St. Albans, took place in 1455. The Yorks of the White Rose won this battle, and many high-ranking Lancasters of the Red Rose perished. A truce was signed afterward, but the embers smouldered beneath the ashes. The Lancasters sought revenge, encouraged by Margaret of Anjou, who craved the crown for her son Edward. The skirmishes and battles of the War of the Roses continued. At one point, Richard of York was forced to flee the country, but his primary supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, conquered England and captured King Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton. Margaret of Anjou and the Red Rose nobles gathered a loyal force in northern England and moved south. Richard of York, the head of the White Rose family, was killed in battle. In 1460, the Lancaster forces continued their southward movement and liberated Henry VI in the so-called Second Battle of St. Albans. London lay ahead, but the Red Rose forces never reached it. The White Rose heir, Edward, the eldest son of Richard of York, crushed the Red Rose at the Battle of Towton. Yet the Lancasters were not subdued. Again and again, the Red Rose tried to seize the throne, and their efforts were eventually crowned with success. In 1470, Henry VI became king once more. The enmity between the Roses persisted. In 1471, Edward IV ousted Henry VI and became king himself. The Earl of Warwick, who had supported the Yorks, and the Red Rose heirs perished at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, and soon Henry VI was killed as well. But rebellions and slaughters continued. In the process, Henry Tudor emerged, a distant relative of the Red Rose Lancasters. He became King Henry VII, ending the Red Rose dynasty and beginning the reign of the House of Tudor, which established a new dynasty with its own colors. The descendants of the White Rose Yorks attempted to seize power several more times, organizing slaughters and revolts. But the resistance was gradually suppressed and the rebels imprisoned. Historians consider the year 1487 the end of the War of the Roses, though some rebellions flickered here and there for another decade.
Well then, all this nonsense of the elite seizing power with their revolts, slaughters, and greed for wealth is quite exhausting. But what can be done? Someone once said, "He who does not remember the past lives without a future." I apologize to the reader for this overly long introduction. Now, let us move on to the War of the Roses that took place in the first quarter of the 21st century in a small border state of the European Union. This was, as noted earlier, a soft War of the Roses. It lasted only 48 hours and took place in a castle located atop a high hill, the State Council building, and its surroundings. Though this War of the Roses was soft, it was all the more fierce in its emotional intensity. To the citizens living in the lower town, the sounds of the bickering, the screaming during chases, and the thuds of clubs against the skulls of rival roses echoed from afar. In truth, the bickering was mainly between two roses, the two leading parties, the leading opposition party and the leading coalition party. The other, smaller parties simply watched and kept their mouths shut. But as always, when the fighting starts and the sticks begin to wave, everyone joins in. The reader likely asks, the names of the parties? Tell the reader the names of the parties outright. Dear reader, party names are changed like foot wraps in the Russian army every 2 weeks as soon as they start to stink. But the worldviews of the State Council members changed even more frequently. To be honest, it wasn't even the opposition party bickering with the coalition party, but rather the leading figures of these parties, or, more accurately, their families, since the aforementioned figures were represented in the State Council by families or dynasties. Thus, the bickering that eventually led to a brawl was between two dynasties. For simplicity's sake, let us call them the White Rose and Red Rose dynasties. The leading figure of the opposition, an older aristocrat with a mustache, was a representative of the White Rose family. He passionately desired to hold the reins of government so he could pass them hand to the descendants of his White Rose dynasty, his spinster daughters. The power figure of the leading coalition party, a man, belonged to the Red Rose family. He was busy shaping his own dynasty around the state pie. A power struggle is a madness, but it becomes particularly insane when different families, clans, and dynasties enter the fray, as happened in the English War of the Roses, and has happened here, in the State Council of this small EU border state. How is such a thing possible under the conditions of a deep, albeit quite thin, democracy? After all, it is a democracy. I shall explain further to the good reader, and I apologize in advance. The reader is surely waiting, based on the experience of the historical War of the Roses, for when the grand scuffle, the hitting, the slaughter, and the chase will begin in the State Council. Please, have a little patience. The small nation in question gained independence 20-some years ago. Some politicians also note that it regained independence. It is hard to say whether it was independence or re-independence, for the intervening period was a rather confused time, and to be honest, can a small nation squeezed between great powers ever truly be independent? But one way or another, this small nation became independent. It was necessary to devise and adopt a constitution for a sovereign and independent state. The brightest minds of the nation, doctors of legal science, managed this quite quickly and simply. One paramount postulate was written into the Constitution. Elections to the State Council shall be general, uniform, and secret. Beautiful and democratic. But following the Constitution, it was necessary to pass a State Council Election Act. Lawyers were no longer allowed near the drafting of this law. Politicians took over.
Former heads of departments of the Communist Party Central Committee, secretaries of regional party committees, former kolkhoz chairmen, sovkhoz directors, party organizers, and other high-ranking echelons of the Russian occupation era. Regarding the Election Act, only one question caused concern: how to ensure that the voters' votes go first to those families, clans, and dynasties that should receive them, meaning the former red nomenclatura, who had categorized themselves as red or seemingly white. And that was that. Furthermore, with the independence of this small state, two dynasties were developing rapidly, the clans of the Red and White Roses.
What was to be done? It is the state's duty to protect the lives and health of its citizens, for lex recte facere iubet, vetat delinquere. The law commands to act rightly and forbids wrongdoing. A clever trick was devised. Parties, or families, clans, dynasties, would go to the elections with their own lists, ensuring that members of the Red and White Rose dynasties were in the top 10 of the candidate list, with the first number always being the head figure of the dynasty himself. To keep things democratic, the institution of nondescript individual candidates was also invented. The reader likely asks, what mystery does a family election list hold, especially its first 10 numbers? It is very simple. It is a matter of simple mathematics and an elementary understanding of human soul anatomy. Knowing these two things, success always follows, because the voter always chooses from the first 10 of the list, and a vast majority chooses exactly number 1. Why is it so? Let us return to primeval times, when humans lived almost as animals, though walking on 2 legs and carrying a club on their shoulders. But the club was mainly carried by the leader of the herd, figuratively speaking, the individual who was number 1 on the list. If anyone in the herd showed disobedience to the leader, they immediately caught a club to the head, forcing them to obey the number 1 on the list. This ensured the standard life and sustainable development of the primitive herd. This primeval arrangement and leadership worked for millennia, always a club to the head, and the leader was always right. And now, tens of millennia later, the human, Homo sapiens, stepping toward the ballot box, instinctively tucks their head between their shoulders and makes a cross next to number 1, the leader of the herd. Some mark a family member or relative of the lead figure. Homo sapiens drops the ballot and leaves with a sigh of relief. They didn't get a club to the head after all. But that wasn't all. Though the Constitution stipulates that elections are general, uniform, and secret, the former red nomenclatura ignored this postulate when devising the Election Act. If there is to be freedom, let it be boundless. If there is to be democracy, let it be total. Postulates were written into the Election Act allowing for advance voting over 2 months via computer or smartphone, as well as dropping ballots into mailboxes. Bundles of these ballots lay scattered on tables in post offices. Voting at the actual polling stations lasted only 1 day and was mainly intended as a formality, just in case some outdated individual felt like tramping to the station on Election Day. The election deadline arrived. Advance voting began. Across nursing homes, nursing hospitals, and the stairwells of panel block apartments, young men and women, known as political broilers, began to roam. The boys carried laptops, the girls carried plastic bags with mementos. If the owner of a nursing home or hospital belonged to the Red Rose family, only those political broilers aiming to hoist the Red Rose dynasty to power were allowed to enter. Nursing homes belonging to the White Rose family followed the same pattern, except this time, entry was open only to White Rose political broilers. Voting was simple. A political broiler shoved the elderly person's ID card into the laptop slot. A nurse handed over a slip of paper with the ID card codes. A few button presses later, the elder's voice, their
free and independent expression of will, moved through space into the central server of the election commission located in the castle atop the high hill. But so that the elder would know what to tell inspectors, they were handed a packet of green tea featuring the candidate's face and name, decorated with a red rose. The White Rose family, however, offered voters a rather thick, white-colored pen with the candidate's name in black ink and a white rose on a black background. E-voting was a success, but not entirely. Working the stairwells and apartments of the blockhouses was an eternal curse for the political broilers. Often the door was opened by individuals in a state of heavy alcohol intoxication, some holding a kitchen knife or an axe. Fortunately, there were no serious incidents, though young men were punched in the jaw or kicked in the backside, and laptops were thrown out of stairwell windows. As for the girl broilers, their skirts were flipped up, their waistbands grabbed, their panties ripped off in one yank and thrown out where the laptops had just landed. E-voting in 5- and 9-story apartment blocks was not a success. Smartphone voting was an entirely different matter. It went better than expected. It was an extraordinary success. When the votes from smartphones were tallied, it turned out that 10 times more votes had been cast via phone than there were inhabitants in the small country, from infants to demented elders. This anomalous circumstance caused some confusion among the IT men of the Central Election Commission, yet it wasn't particularly disturbing to them. They were only interested in one question, a purely technical one. How was this possible? As always, the ruined youth were to blame. 2,000 years ago, the ancient Romans blamed the fall of the Roman Empire on a ruined youth who lived lives of leisure, loitering in disco bars from one dance to another. But what was the fault of the youth in the first quarter of the 21st century? The people were given the opportunity to vote via smartphone during the advance elections because, by this point, all the technical means, IT solutions, and the brain potential of the voters for such smart voting were in place. And people began to vote. On the streets, everywhere, one could see people walking with hunched backs, heads on their chests, smartphones in front of their eyes, and fingers pressing buttons. Advance voting was in progress. Often, a voter would stop at a crosswalk in the middle of the road, occupied with voting. Drivers were polite. They didn't honk. Let the person vote. They are fulfilling their civic duty. They voted on public transport, in cinemas, in theaters, and in more intimate places. Sometimes a citizen felt the urge to vote upon entering a shop. They would stop in the doorway and start voting, pressing the buttons of the smartphone, choosing the state council. But someone coming from behind, unaware that the person was engaged in an event of state importance, would give the citizen poking at their phone a light nudge with a knee to the backside. A nudge is a nudge, but such a slight startle caused a finger to hit the wrong button, creating a significant confusion of state importance. A citizen wishing to vote for the red rose accidentally hit the white rose button. But the politicians and IT men had anticipated such a thing, erroneous voting or a sudden change of heart, and a citizen could change their vote an infinite number of times during the entire advance voting period. As they say, don't be a fool, be clever. But what about the youth, our golden youth, the next generation of voters? Teenage boys and girls quickly found the key through internet tutorials and Chinese gadgets to hack into the Central Election Commission's server, and they began to vote. They voted during classes, while loitering on the street, in disco bars, on the school bus, and while riding bicycles, legs pedaling and both hands holding a smartphone. The bicycle handlebars wobbled here and there, and the bikes followed suit. Sometimes they fell flat on their faces. The youth generally didn't care whether it was the red or white rose. They just kept pressing and pressing buttons, voting and voting. Sometimes, however, teenagers debated among themselves whether to give the vote to the red or white rose, but it would have been better if they hadn't. The debates often turned into quarrels, and the quarrels sometimes ended in fights. Boys gave each other bloody noses, and girls pulled each other's hair. This disrupted the process slightly, but it did not stop the voting. Some active teenager, a future political broiler, managed to vote 10 or 20 times in a single day. The police tried to stop, or at least curb, this voting pandemic, but it remained a powerless gesture. And what can you do with teenagers? You can't use the rod, and scolding doesn't help. But the parents, fine them? How can you fine someone who works for minimum wage, or is unemployed, or has become incapacitated due to the effects of corona? A nightmare.
The IT men at the central server tried to solve the matter with technical means, but the software developers, mainly American firms, had not anticipated such a mess in a tiny country, so no programs were available to stop teenagers from voting with smartphones. Finally, the IT men angrily kicked the metal casing of the central server and said, "Let the devils vote. We'll count the votes later, and we'll count them as needed." An entirely different type of state council election, one might even say a model example of democracy, took place in the post offices. Ballots with candidate lists were on the table with a ballpoint pen tied to a string. Everything as it should be. The voter citizen stepped to the table, took the ballots for the red and white rose candidates, and paused. For the simple person, the so-called ordinary person, it was hard to tell the difference between the red and white rose dynasties. They seemed too far away and high up. And as for election promises, much is promised, but things go as they always do. The voter stood at the table, twirling the pen in confusion, whom to choose. Almost as if by themselves, his eyes settled on the first names on the lists. The voter decided a cross should be made next to the first name. Candidate number 1. This was decided, but on which list, the red or white rose? The voter had heard rumors that both dynasties were corrupt, stealing from the state as much as they could, and had grown arrogant to boot. The voter remembered one heart-stinging incident. The lead figure of the White Rose, an older man but with dyed mustaches, was walking with his 2 adult daughters, aged 30 to 40, at the president's reception in the Rose Garden. The name Rose Garden came from the fact that white rose bushes grew on one side of the path and red roses on the other. The president, wishing to be neutral, had given the gardener specific instructions. The White Rose family was strolling through the garden. Unexpectedly, or perhaps by arrangement, a correspondent from a private TV channel stopped the White Rose elite and asked them to pose with their backs to the white rose bushes. The camera was pointed at the father and daughters, and the correspondent shoved a microphone under the mustache. "May I ask one question for our channel?" "By all means," said the father. The daughters nodded in agreement. "You worked for years in the European Union Commission. Tell our people, the working class and the country folk, what does it feel like to be back in the homeland?" The White Rose elite, pleased by the question and the camera, said with a smile, "The feeling is good, except that in Brussels or Strasbourg, you can walk into any restaurant and the service is always good and the food is delicious." Foolish question and foolish answer. There are things you don't tell the people, things the people don't need to know. Yet sometimes, when you need to smear honey on the people's lips, it is said, "The people are the bearers of supreme power." The voter in the post office was still twirling the pen, not knowing what to do. But where the need is greatest, help is nearest. Those in line waiting to send or receive packages stood behind the voter and peeked over his shoulder, huffing quietly. Finally, one of them couldn't hold back and suggested, "Make a cross for the Red Rose leader." It was like a starting pistol. Immediately, a corpulent lady holding a large package suggested, "What red? Enough with the reds. Put the cross for the White Rose." "White roses are thieves," someone shouted from the back. "That on the red rose." "Red roses are corrupt," a sturdy man shouted threateningly,
brandishing hockey sticks that had just arrived in a package from America. The pre-election agitation and propaganda gained momentum. The shouting grew louder. Here and there, fists were used. Women who had come for food parcels screamed in bass voices, and girls sending registered love letters shrieked shrilly. At the sound of the ruckus, the postmaster appeared at the back door. He adjusted his postman's cap with the large cockade more firmly on his head and shouted authoritatively, "What is this noise? Silence, or I'll throw everyone out and close the post office for a whole week." The threat worked. It became quiet as a mouse. In the silence, the postmaster's businesslike but now gentle voice was heard. "What is the matter, citizens? What is bothering you?" The corpulent lady with the large package, an active person despite being a White Rose supporter, said, "We are bickering over these two dynasties, each worse than the other, though I find the White Rose less worse. We can't decide whom to choose." The shouting began again. The postmaster raised his hand for silence and said calmly, Wait, let me think. Let's do this. We'll conduct an advance vote right here. Those in favor of the White Rose, raise your hands." Hands went up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the postmaster counted aloud. "You can lower them. Now, raise your hands those who support the Red Rose." Hands went up. The postmaster counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well then, the majority favored the Reds. Voter, put your cross for the Reds. The corpulent lady adjusted her package and headed for the door, muttering to herself, "Reds in power again. Still in power. Can't get rid of these Reds for once." The large assembly hall of the State Council hummed. The deputies were gathering for their first post-election session. Name tags were placed on the tables, and finding seats didn't take long. The benches were paired, and there were 3 rows. In the left row sat the representatives of the Red Rose dynasty. In the middle row, the White Rose, and in the third row, by the window, the Slough, the small, bribable parties or individual candidates who had bought their way in. The first 2 benches of the Red Rose row were occupied by the Red Rose family. In the front bench sat the father and mother side by side, and behind them their 2 sons, aged 35 to 40. Behind them sat the Red Rose elite. In the front bench of the White Rose row sat the mustachioed head figure and his wife, and behind them their 2 daughters in little white dresses, looking like bridesmaids. Their age has already been mentioned and needn't be repeated. Behind the maidens sat the most prominent elite of the White Rose family. The chairman of the State Council, an old and experienced hand, wasted no time on formalities. Procedural questions were solved quickly and actions carried out flawlessly. Since it was the first session of the new council, there were no bills or voting on the agenda. The chairman stood up behind his high desk, flicked the microphone to check it, and said, "Honored deputies, I congratulate you on taking up your work in the nation's supreme power organ. This is a great honor, but also a great responsibility. We won't sit long today. It's the first session, and let's be honest, your backsides aren't used to the seats yet. Today we shall converse friendly on topics of interest, express our opinions, or, as they say nowadays, to test and map one another. In the evening, there will be a celebratory dinner for the State Council members, a holy supper, so to speak, in the restaurant of the Radisson Hotel. Questions regarding the government will be left for the next session. Until then, the former government continues in full. If you agree to this agenda, let us begin. The Minister of Justice has the floor." A youngish, dark-haired Minister of Justice stepped to the lectern with an energetic stride. He held no documents or papers. Clearly wishing to give his words more weight and demonstrate his youthful memory, the minister intended to improvise. He poured himself half a glass of mineral water, drank it, and, without coughing, as one usually does after vodka, began his speech. Honored deputies, allow me also to wish you strength and success in your difficult but rewarding work. But what do I want to tell you? Several sensible and timely articles regarding family issues have appeared in the media. Both wise and, in my opinion, unwise thoughts on amending the Family Act have been presented. Such expression of opinions in the media creates a rather turbulent situation, and here, not only the government, but the Parliament must have its say. Honored deputies, discussions on topics like marriage, family, love, and sex are clearly perceived by us all as an intrusion into a person's private life. I would even say an attack on our privacy zone. In these matters, media interference is inappropriate. Pointing fingers is inappropriate. The state cannot force a person to have sex with this one or that one, and even less can it force someone to love. Love is the only thing we have that is lasting and unchanging. Everything else is fleeting. Therefore, the Ministry of Justice proposes amendments and additions to the Family Act. I point out to the deputies that while the current Family Act contains the words marriage and family, not a single paragraph defines the word love. There is not even a reference to love in the law, as if love didn't exist, or as if the Founding Fathers had lost not only the word, but the most beautiful, noble, and desirable feeling of a human being. The chairman of the State Council cleared his throat into the microphone and said loudly, "I ask you to keep the making love part short. Stick to the regulations or I'll turn off the microphone." A roar and a clamor rose in the hall. Applause was heard here and there. Female deputies wanted the speech to continue. The men were against it. The slough by the window stayed silent, and the gender-neutral ones wanted to hear the minister's summary and proposal. Shouts were heard from the hall. "Let him continue. Let him present his specific proposal. Enough about love for now." The chairman said, "Continue, Mr. Minister. You have 5 minutes." The minister poured another half glass of water, drank it in one gulp, and said in a firm voice, "I propose renaming the Family Act the Love Act, establishing paragraphs for the protection and development of love, and removing the paragraph that regulates family and marriage in its current, so-called traditional form." Holy heaven, all hell broke loose. The Red Rose dynasty was entirely against such changes. Imagine attacking traditional marriage, which is sacred and untouchable. But the White Rose representatives, considering that the leading family had 2 unmarried daughters, or rather 2 spinster maidens, favored love. They favored the Love Act, and they defended their position fiercely and passionately. The old moustache man personally slammed the Red Rose leader over the head with a chair and received a similar blow from the Red Rose matriarch. The White Rose daughters beat the married Red Rose sons with their handbags wherever they could, screaming shrilly. The sound of splintering chairs echoed across the hall. They had begun to break chairs so they could use the legs to club the representatives of the rival dynasty. The Prime Minister and the other ministers vanished from the gallery. They were seen running through the castle's underground passage toward the railway station. It is unknown whether they boarded the train to Moscow or Brussels. But the Red Rose had a slight majority in the State Council, and they managed to push the White Rose dynasty out of the castle and into the courtyard. There, they were chased with chair legs and clubs. The screams and the thuds of the sticks reached the ears of the Lower Town residents, who said, "The Red Rose and White Rose are at it again. Power is so sweet and profitable to them that they will never be subdued." One representative of the slough sitting by the window, who had reached the council with the help of his father's oil business with Russia, had suddenly changed his worldview. He climbed the flagpole on the castle tower with the flag of the Russian Federation between his teeth. His goal was to tear down the national flag and hoist the imperial flag connecting them with Russia. Fortunately, the security guards watching the castle, who, according to internal regulations, did not interfere in the deputies' brawl,
noticed this fellow who had suddenly changed his colors and pulled him down from the pole. They shoved his flag down his pants, as they did not have the right to confiscate personal property.
The White Rose representatives, trying to save themselves, hid in the catacombs beneath the castle. The dynasty leader descended into the cellar with his daughters and into the tunnels, hoping to escape the castle in secret. They waded through the water collected at the bottom of the catacombs toward a light shimmering in the distance. But alas, the exit was blocked by heavy iron bars.
Darkness fell. The father and daughters crouched on a stone step by the bars. Rats swam past their feet, their eyes glowing green. The daughters shivered with cold and fear. It seemed that at any moment the large, long-tailed nits would attack. Their stomachs were empty. They wanted something to eat. The White Rose mustache man remembered his recent interview. To the correspondent's question, "What does it feel like to be back in the homeland?" he had replied, pleased with himself. "The feeling is good, except that in Brussels or Strasbourg you can walk into any restaurant and the service is always good and the food is delicious."
In the morning, as it began to grow light, shouts were heard in the catacombs.
"White Rose, crawl out. At 10 o'clock, the president arrives at the State Council session to present a compromise proposal."
Before 10, the deputies gathered in the assembly hall. Some had blue eyes, some bloody cheeks, or heads bandaged with rags. Some limped on sticks, supporting a right leg or a left, with an arm tied in a towel around the neck. The Prime Minister and his ministers had returned, as had the Chancellor of Justice. The deputies took their seats. A silence fell, broken only by miserable huffing and groaning. The president entered through the back door and immediately stepped to the lectern without the chairman announcing him. None of the deputies stood up, and how could you, when your legs were still shaking from yesterday's slaughter? The chairman started to say something into the microphone, but then waved his hand. His mutter was heard across the hall. "To hell with it." The president adjusted the microphone, glanced at the Red Dynasty, then looked long at the slough by the window, and finally turned his gaze to the White Roses. He began his speech. "Deputies, I have become aware of your fierce debates regarding the Family Act and the Love Act. I find that to debate, one must first listen to and understand one another. I have developed doubts about your level of education, whether it is too low or entirely non-existent. In a parliamentary government, in a democratic society, fists and chair legs are not the best arguments for explaining one's positions. I point out to you that the concept of a traditional family is not established anywhere in our nation's laws. We have managed without it until now, and we shall manage in the future. What is important is love. It must be preserved and protected at the state level. In our lives, only love shows the way. It is determining and meaningful. Love is a bridge, not only between two people, but between people in general. And gender or gender neutrality has no importance here. I came here before you to offer a compromise solution that ensures the legal protection of all cohabiting couples, regardless of how many pairs there are, whether they are man and woman, or women, or men, or entirely gender neutral. I would propose repealing the Family Act and developing an entirely new law regulating human relations to be called the Blended Family Act. Carupere. Undoubtedly, this law must establish sufficient paragraphs and postulates to strengthen and favor love, for the basis of a blended family is, after all, love. Furthermore, unlike traditional marriage, a blended family legally, de jure, does not dissolve, but factually, de facto, upon its so-called dissolution, it actually expands. It can expand infinitely. Or, as the greatest humanists of mankind, Sigmund Freud and Immanuel Kant said, all of humanity on our planet is one large, blended family. Regarding the family, we must look at things more broadly. There are poor families and very poor families. There are rich families and very rich families. There are families living together and families living apart. Also, one must not forget a family that significantly influences the state and state officials, the mafia family. All these families need love, care, and protection in the same way, and this can only be fully ensured by a state-accepted, blended family, based purely on love. And as I already said, a person's gender or gender neutrality, their wealth, or their behavior in society has no importance whatsoever. Love is behind everything. I ask the government to develop a draft for the Blended Family Act and present it to the State Council for discussion, and after the appropriate procedures, to vote in favor of its adoption. Thank you for listening.
The president left the lectern and exited through the back door. Applause broke out in the hall at the end of the speech, quite lively, though no great enthusiasm was felt. The concept of the Blended Family Act was initially quite foreign to everyone, though it contained several kernels of rational thought. The leaders of the Red Rose dynasty waved it off. If it's a blended family, then so be it. A blended family can consist of 2, 3, or 4 people. The White Rose daughters, however, rejoiced. Now they could soon hope to lose their virginity in this blended family. And it was about time.
The chairman of the State Council stood up and said, "The War of the Roses, the session is over." He paused and added ironically into the microphone, "Let it be a blended family then. Even your own wife feels like a stranger when she's on the hay in the neighbor's barn." Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.